charisma and by the seduction of his oratory. People don't know, Malcolm was also a journalist. He first published Muhammad Speaks, and what we have are his speeches, but those speeches by one of his former assistants, Benjamin Goodman, only detailed from 1962 to 1965, and the collection's called The End of White World Supremacy. And then Malcolm X Speaks only goes from March 1964 until February 21st, 1965. So there is much of Malcolm still to be discovered. But as I say, the problem understanding Malcolm as a thinker is because listening to Malcolm was so emotionally fulfilling. He made real this concept that has been attributed to Jesse Jackson, I am somebody. He made you as an individual and black people generally feel that we were somebody. In a society, in a nation that found and suggested black people were unworthy, Malcolm affirmed this. And when people talk about Malcolm as being a hater, and being so angry, the very first black historian was a man by the name of George Washington Williams, who began the first extended history of black people in this country shortly after the Civil War. And one of the things that he said, and George Washington Williams said, he said, I have tracked, I'm paraphrasing now, I have tracked my people through these pages, and these pages have been blistered with my tears. If you read black history, or Native American history, or Chinese history, if you read the history about the Mexican War, if you read about Vietnam, which you've never been told the truth about, there was a mutiny of the troops in Vietnam. You should read a book called Power of the Dragon. It gives you something, or see the DVD Hamburger Hill to see what Vietnam was really all about. But what Malcolm did was to think of Malcolm. It's not about Malcolm per se. It isn't about the minutiae of Malcolm's life. What Malcolm did was to take the history of black people, and he said that this history represents a repudiation of America's claims to be a nation committed to human equality and freedom. That our existence was the ultimate verification of that great untruth, that America was not what it claimed to be. Now go back to your high school days, or even your junior high school days. And suppose your history teacher asked you, let us estimate, conjecture, who the greatest presidents America had. Usually people say Washington. More modern people will say Kennedy. Most people say Lincoln. And we say, all right, fine. And what president was Lincoln? He was the 16th president. Now I want you to imagine that E.T. comes down from his little world in the sky and asks you to explain America to him. And you begin with that fact, that Lincoln was the 16th of now 44 presidents. And then you tell E.T. that of those 16 presidents, 11 were slave owners. What's your concept of America then? Or let us go to what makes America exceptional. What made America exceptional is that it had something called, quote, free land, unquote. Because the land in Europe was owned by the aristocracy and the monarchy and the church. So the pilgrims who came here, and that's another myth, Pilgrims were a small minority on the Mayflower, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony is not the first permanent English settlement in this land. The first permanent English settlement in this land is Jamestown in 1607. But they don't want you to think about Jamestown as opposed to the Plymouth Plantation, because Jamestown is a creature of the Virginia Company. It was created by capitalists to make money, not people fleeing here to escape religious persecution. Nor do they tell you about the people who constituted the first so-called colonists. 50,000 of them were convicts. Australia only becomes a penal colony after the success of the American Revolution. The convicts that worked in England were shipped here, and they sold women in Virginia, bride purchase for 2 barrels of tobacco. None of that's in the history. So here we have this so-called free land, except there were some people inhabiting it called Native Americans. So go back to your presidential example. And let us ask, in these years, in the treaties that were made between the American government and the Native American peoples, how many of those treaties did they break? They broke all 400 treaties. So then where is this great morality? And you see, that's what Malcolm represented. Malcolm said, the most rewarding study of all is the study of history. To know the history. And if you plunge into that history, if any of you are in English, you need to read a book. It's a collection of short stories by Richard Wright. Most people believe Native Son is Richard Wright's greatest contribution to American literature. I disagree. You need to read a collection called Uncle Tom's Children. It was published in 1938. It is the first book to describe the ubiquity, the arbitrary lethal nature of Southern racism. No one had ever written with the authenticity that Richard Wright did what racism was like at a time when most black people lived in the South. The South, as one of my Harvard classmates once said, William Melvin Kelly, for a very long time was the Negro's home country. And so the mechanisms necessary to control us and the social and the racial caste system that was developed to control us is the society under which we live for most of our existence in this country. People only began to leave after the Civil War, and this is one of the places they came to. They came to Nebraska, and Pap Singleton took them to Kansas. But black people looked everywhere to go someplace to be somebody. They went to Florida, they went to Mexico, they went to Canada, they went to China, they went to Europe, they went to Haiti, they went to the Caribbean. They're trying to find some place on this earth to be treated as a human being as they were not being treated in America. That is the point that Malcolm made. Bob Crispin was talking about the guys on 125th Street. They would have their ladders and they would be talking about issues of the day. And one of the more famous people was a famous bookstore in Harlem run by Louis Michaud, who was Oscar Michaud's brother. And we have him captured in Eyes on the Prize. In one particular episode, you will see Michaud haranguing the people on 125th Street. And the question he asks is, how can you believe in this no-good country? Now, to appreciate Malcolm, to appreciate how black people felt and how symptomatic this so-called rage was, you have to understand what made so many people join the Nation of Islam. Why did they join? Why did they join? Why did they join an organization whose leader, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, said white people were devils? And that America's time was up. The evil empire was going to come to an end. They joined because, although you may not have agreed with all of the allegories, most of what Elijah said, and certainly what Malcolm said, because Malcolm built the nation. There were less than 1,000 people in the nation when Malcolm joined. But when he came out of prison in 1952, he built over 100 mosques. Tens of thousands of people joined the Nation of Islam. The question is why? And that is why one needs to appreciate Malcolm's significance. It ain't about Malcolm. It's about the America Malcolm describes and how the description of the America that he describes was so resonant to so many black people in those days and still. Think about now, when I say he was a theoretician, Malcolm said that democracy is hypocrisy. And he defined racism as always being a double standard. And think about today. There is now controversy about, as I said, these minutiae of Malcolm's life. As Bob said today, these facts. But the important question is not the facts. The important question is what he called the myths. All right, I disagree with that. Malcolm isn't about myths. Malcolm represents a legend. He represents a legend, and it's a legend that has grown and had super influence. If any of you, on hundreds of thousands of people, according to one such individual who was so effective, Spike Lee. Spike Lee read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and this is what he said after reading the book. He said, "This is the most important book I'll ever read. It changed the way I thought. It changed the way I acted. It has given me courage that I didn't know I had inside me. I'm one of hundreds of thousands whose life was changed for the better because he read the autobiography of Malcolm X." It changed him. It took him out of the self-delusions, as I said, where America is essentially, what is a nigger? It is a negation. It means you ain't worth squat. That I would use if you speak German, it's scheiße or caca. ¿Quién habla español aquí? Nobody speaks Spanish here? Incredible. Y'all better learn Spanish. Now more Latinos in this country than there are black people. You better learn Espanol. So, Malcolm was a man of action. There was always a tension between the ideology and the theology he received at the hands of Elijah Muhammad and what he himself wanted to do. It was, Malcolm was always confronting the question of police brutality. He comes into prominence. It comes to the attention of people who then joined the March No. 7 in 1957 because the police beat up a man named Hinton Johnson, who was a member of Malcolm's mosque, and then they claimed they didn't have him in the police station. And Malcolm went with the lawyer, and then we don't know the exact number, but then hundreds of guys from the mosque came and stood outside the police station. And they stood outside for hours and hours and scared the cops to death. And we had one policeman saying that nobody should have that. At a particular point, Malcolm waves his hand and they go away. And the response of the cops is that no one should have that much power. Even of course, no black man should have that much power. and how dangerous it was if he could tell those men if they followed him to do X action, perhaps they would follow him to do Y action and threaten the nation. So the FBI began keeping a file on Malcolm. And in 1952, as soon as he got out of prison, of course they kept files on everybody. You ever heard of Raycon? You know you've never heard of Raycon. Before the FBI was the FBI, it was called the General Bureau of Investigation. And when Hoover took over, they established, after they got rid of Marcus Garvey, they spent 3 years trying to decide how they were going to get rid of Marcus Garvey. And finally they got him on what they call the Violation of the Mann Act, transporting women across the state lines for immoral purposes. So Johnson left and went to Mexico and finally came back and did serve his time. But Racial Conditions was a surveillance program. They were especially concerned that black people might identify with the Germans in World War I. And then later they were concerned about black people supporting the Japanese in World War II. And the Japanese sent to this country a man who was a high official in the Japanese CIA, Baron Tanaka. And Baron Tanaka came to this country, especially to Chicago, and there were very many Japanese and Black American associations that were established. So Elijah Muhammad goes to jail rather than fight. And when Malcolm was drafted, he says, yes, he'd be happy to go to war, because he wanted to organize the black soldiers to join with the Japanese to fight the white soldiers. So they said, I think you're for it. we don't think we want you in this army. So his influence, the analysis that you've seen with Spike Lee, and it grows and it grows. Because if you heard Malcolm, you might not agree with what he said at that particular moment. But what he said will stick with you. That's why, you know, they call Ronald Reagan, some people back in the day used to call Ronald Reagan the great communicator. Malcolm was the great communicator. If you were confused about something, if you're confused now about American involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, because, let me ask you, how many of you watched the upsurge, the uprisings in Egypt? You watched those on television? In Egypt? Did you watch the uprisings in Libya? Did you watch the uprisings in Tunisia? You better get with the world, Jack. America's an empire. Understand that? You will graduate, most of you will graduate $24,000 in debt because they're killing Pell Grants. And when I was in school, there was no such thing as loans that were orchestrated by the banks. This is what the right wing has done in privatizing this society. But America is an empire. It has 700 bases around the world. It has built all this ridiculous talk about the debt, when they're spending trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which are under these puppet Maliki and Karzai. But to go back to the point. So we've established that the American media can provide you on-site coverage from Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. Now, when is the last time you saw on-site coverage from Iraq and Afghanistan? The answer is never. They're not reporting. That's what they learned from Vietnam. Not to let the journalists tell the American people what was going on in Vietnam. So all you hear about what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan are press conferences by Petraeus and McChrystal and the military. But they're not showing you what the Afghans are saying. The Taliban controls 2/3 of Afghanistan. There's 30% of electricity a day in Kabul. But none of that is in the American media. You have a passport? Do you have passports? Have you been outside of the country? If you go outside of this country and see the news, the rest of the world knows what's going on. Only Americans don't know what's going on. Even Murdoch's Sky News is better in Britain than Fox News here. You are being propagandized. 35 years ago, there were almost 50 companies that control the media. Now only 5 control the media. They fired Keith Olbermann from MSNBC. MSNBC is owned by NBC. NBC is owned by General Electric. You paid more taxes than General Electric. You know that? GE paid Zippo last year. Zippo. Bank of America paid Zippo last year. The system is corrupt. In fact, as a friend of mine said, it is not simply true that the system is corrupt. Corruption is the system. It is you have credit cards? You have credit cards?
Yes, sir.
They're charging you rates. Look at that APR. They are charging you rates that they lock people up for usury in the Middle Ages. And no one says squat. You're flying in planes that are 35 years old where the roofs are dropping out of the planes, orchestrated by an air traffic control system using technology that's 35 years old. You're drinking water that's contaminated, 40% carcinogens. Everybody you know somewhere has cancer, and why? You go to Subway, you're eating processed food. It's chemicals. The chicken, if you're not eating free-range chicken, you're eating chemicals. And turkeys, you're eating chemicals. But nobody says squat. It's kind of devilish, really. It is, because they do not care about you. Don't you understand that? They do not care about you. They charge you for your bags on the planes. They wanted to charge you, they're talking about charging you to put your luggage in the overhead bin. They were talking about charging you to sit by the window or to sit by the aisle. You're all kind. Look at your tickets the next time you fly somewhere. Look at the cost of the fare, and then look at these little taxes and fees. The same thing with your electric bill and your telephone bill. Why there is not, a friend of mine once said, not too long ago, why there is not a revolution in this country, he cannot understand. Every day, in every way, you are being screwed. So, that's what Malcolm said, and Malcolm's influence went far beyond Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks. Malcolm was the first to talk about the poison of white power. But Malcolm's influence, his analysis was such that as the movement developed, people came to Malcolm's analysis because he was there ahead of us all the time, denouncing American intervention in the Third World before there was a national anti-war movement, before there were clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. Indeed, before most of us could even spell Vietnam, Malcolm was on it. Malcolm was ahead of us. He was ahead of his time. But Malcolm's time was coming. The flow of the river of black struggle, to borrow my friend Vincent Harding's image, was coursing inevitably toward Malcolm's positions, Malcolm's analyses, Malcolm's critique. More importantly, his people, the urban masses, were taking an increasingly larger role. The movement, what made the movement a movement? It begins with working class people in Montgomery. Now, I heard something about a dorm here. Dickinson? A dorm. You all live in dorms? You all live in dorms?
Some do, some do.
What's the biggest dorm on campus? You don't have dorms? You all live in, On the street, where do y'all live? There are no dorms?
Still kind of quasi-commuter and some dorms.
All right, well, quasi then.
There's a couple dorms.
What's the biggest living residence?
Something village,
at
right?
the university? What's the biggest one? Where do the football players stay? The cornhuskers, where
They
do
took that
stay?
too.
They took that too? Well, just think about whatever the largest hangout is. How difficult would it be? How challenging would it be for you to organize the people in that locale or in your favorite bar to organize people to stay together for a year? Because that's what the Montgomery bus boycott did. 40,000 people stayed together for a year, despite all the attempts to destroy that movement. Petty racist things that were done against them. But this is the working class, supported by the black middle class. And then you got black students, the Freedom Riders and the sit-ins, and as Zeb mentioned, SNCC. And then you had Martin in Albany, Georgia, and then he goes to Birmingham. Martin goes to Birmingham, what was called the Battle of Birmingham. And they tried to whack Martin. The movement headquarters was at a place called A.G. Gaston's Motel, which they bombed. They also bombed in a little gratuitous bit of racism. They also bombed the home of his brother, A.D. King. The response to that was that the people rose up. The first urban rebellion is in Birmingham, Alabama, in May of 1963. These are Malcolm's people. And you then have rebellions throughout this land over the next half decade, everywhere. Newark, Detroit, New York, Boston, little places you never heard of like Nyack, New York. Almost all were against real or perceived instances of police brutality. So with the exception of the attempt to whack Martin in '63, and then the successful attempt to assassinate him in '68, in which 200 cities blew up. All of them were related to the contradiction between black people and the American police of this land. So I mentioned Raycon. Raycon developed into something called COINTELPRO, which you can look up on your computer, counterintelligence program. One of its aims was to prevent the rise of a black messiah, to prevent black unity. And they did all kinds of, they wrote false letters, they surveyed, they bugged Martin, they bugged us all. And if you thought that they only were concerned about radicals, they had under surveillance every black beauty shop, every black barber shop, and every black student union in this country. And they also had this NAACP, even though their own agents told Hoover that the NAACP was cool, there were no communist influences, and they had it under surveillance anyway. So go look up COINTELPRO, and you'll see what Malcolm was talking about in regard to the underside of American history. So Malcolm's influence grew and grew and grew. He represented a tradition that goes back as far as David Walker comes forward with Du Bois and Richard Wright, and also comes forward with somebody who you would not associate with Malcolm, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Some of you may know about his anti-Vietnam speech that he gave on April the 4th, 1967 at the Riverside Church in New York, in which he called America the greatest violator of violence, the greatest something violent. Perpetrator, the greatest perpetrator of violence in the world today. That's April. In May, he said, we must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. In order to do that, America's rules have to be changed. This means a revolution of values and of other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together, and you really can't get rid of one without getting rid of the others. In short, now this is not Malcolm X, this is Martin Luther King, as Bayer used to call him, JR. In short, the whole structure of American life must be changed. A difficult challenge in light of the fact that America's problem in restructuring is that she is a conservative nation. Hence, it is imperative that we in the civil rights movement must come all out now and make it clear that America is a hypocritical nation, Malcolm, and that America must set her own house in order. That's what he said in May. In July, he said, most whites are not committed to equal opportunities for Negroes. America has been, and she continues to be, largely a racist society. Maybe something is wrong with our economic system the way it's presently going. There comes a time when any system must be reevaluated, and America's time is at hand. The movement must now address itself to restructuring the whole of American society. The problems that we are dealing with are not going to be solved until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. But all you know about Martin is his having a dream in 1963. The last 5 years of his life have been dropped down Orwell's memory hole. But if you read a book by, again, my mentor, Vincent Harding, has done a book on Martin's last 5 years called The Inconvenient Hero. So that was May, and that was July, and now this is November, 5 months before Martin is whacked. I have found out that all I have been doing in trying to cure this system in America has been in vain. I am trying to get to the roots of it to see just what ought to be done. The whole thing will have to be done away with. The whole thing will have to be done away with. Not Malcolm X, but Martin Luther King Jr. So, Malcolm and Martin are tied together. The accuracy of Malcolm's analysis influenced everybody who was thinking. If you looked and saw little girls being blown up in Birmingham 3 weeks after the March on Washington, if you were in the movement and saw the FBI consorting with the Klan, if you saw, Stokely was, go look up Parchment Penitentiary. There was a brother here from Mississippi. Go look up what Parchment Penitentiary was in Mississippi. Stokely was in prison 26 times. After a while, that gets old. It gets old. And people finally reach the conclusion, which has been falsely, incorrectly attributed to Stokely, but it was actually enunciated by a brother named Worth Long, who was Snick's poet. He said, in false-faced America, we have found you out. That's what Stokely and Ricks were talking about on America's March. False-faced America, we have found you out. So Malcolm and Martin are tied together. They both died at the age of 39. They both had the same time span of 13 years in the struggle, 55 to 68 with Martin, and 52 to 65 with Malcolm. But it is the similarity of the analysis that Martin represents. Malcolm was there before him, but he wound up exactly where Malcolm was. And that's why they both suffered the same fate. To sum up then, In the same way that Karl Marx was the fundamental critic of capitalism, and Frantz Fanon was the fundamental critic of colonialism, Malcolm X was the fundamental critic of American racism. Thank you.
Preguntas, other questions? Brother Omawale, do you permit the audience to have questions? Sure. Yeah. What's our time factor?
Yes, we do have time for questions.
¿Qué pasa?
Yeah, actually, that was
Learn
the,
Spanish.
I think people are going to start enrolling in Spanish right after this lecture. We're going to might have the registration office just be, registrar's office just be overwhelmed.
It's much easier than Mandarin, and you know who's holding the greatest American debt. You know what country has the greatest American debt? Hello?
Mexico.
Dabba dabba doo. Learn Mandarin.
Oh, man. Well, at this time, we certainly have time for question and answer. We have about, we have a little bit of time at this point. And
I had a question. We hear a lot about his journey to Mecca. Could you tell us about some of the other places that he might, have visited? You hear about Mecca. He went to Mecca. What other places in the world might he travel to and spend time?
Well, he went to Morocco. He was in Tanzania. He was in Nigeria. That's where he was renamed. And one of the interesting suggestive facts in regard to Malcolm's assassination is he met Bidwell. Bidwell was then the president of Algeria after Algeria had successfully fought a revolution with the FLN. You ever see the film The Battle of Algiers? You ever heard of this film?
Yeah.
La Guerre d'Algérie? Learn French too.
it's in English, isn't it?
It's in
Subtitles.
English subtitles. Well, The Battle of Algiers is the film that the American military uses to teach its troops about urban guerrilla war. They fought the French from 1954 to 1962, and it is that which Fanon writes about in Les Damnés de la Terre, the wretched of the earth. But after their success, Bidwell was president. Bidwell invited Malcolm to Algeria. There was a conference being held in Algeria in March of 1965, and Malcolm was invited, but so was Che. And Malcolm had met Che when Che came to the UN. They had met. In fact, Che, the very same meeting that Zeb mentioned, where Mrs. Hamer attended. Che was supposed to come to that meeting of Malcolm's as well, but he had to return to Cuba, so he sent a telegram to Malcolm, explaining why he wasn't able to show. So he was twice in Africa. He was in '59 and then again in '60. He was talking to the African revolutionaries in Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, Nyerere, then Morocco, then Nigeria. And of course he traveled. People don't appreciate that he traveled. They have him fixated in Harlem, but he built the mosques all over in the South. He traveled the South, establishing mosques. Although in some states they had outlawed, Arkansas and Alabama had outlawed the NAACP, so much less the Nation of Islam.
I have a question myself.
See?
We have a little conversation about Manny Marable's book. I was wondering if you could be a bit more explicit in terms of your personal feelings about his manuscript and his, as you corrected me last night, allegations regarding Malcolm's life in his new book.
Well, I think, as you said, it's a 600-page volume, and I haven't read it. I haven't read it yet. I started reading it, and what I read so far, to be blunt, I feel it's a dishonest volume. All of you who write, in the piece, the email I wrote to some other friends, because one is getting a zillion emails about this work. But if you're a writer, you communicate your perspective by the words that you choose, especially the adjectives and the adverbs. And Manning begins the book talking about Malcolm's controversial remarks and his provocative remarks. He doesn't tell us controversial to whom, but he gives us an example of what he calls a provocative remark. And that was a remark that Malcolm made in March of 1964. And what Malcolm said is America didn't do the right thing. We did not reform. I'm paraphrasing. He said it much better than I can. But the essence was, if America doesn't reform, the masses are going to rise up and rise up and rise up. He said that in March the 17th, 1964. In July 17th, 1964, Harlem erupted. And it erupted because a Brooklyn cop shot a 15-year-old black boy, and Harlem went up in flames. But it wasn't just Harlem. 7 or 8 other cities went up in 1964. You can look it up in the Kerner Commission report. But instead of Manning then calling attention to the accuracy of Malcolm's prediction, what he did was to quote the New York City Police Commissioner putting Malcolm down. And I find that dishonest. Either he doesn't know black history, he doesn't put things together. And then he goes to the assassination day itself. And he gives an extended description of the people who were in Malcolm's security detail that day, except he leaves out one particular guy. He leaves out Gene Roberts. Gene Roberts was a New York City police agent who had weaseled his way into Malcolm's security detail. So he does raise the issue of the New York cops knowing that Malcolm's life was in danger because Gene Roberts had seen what he called, quote, a dry run on Malcolm's life a week before Malcolm's assassination. So he told the New York Police Department that, but they withdrew all of their forces the day of the assassination. They were comfortably ensconced across the street. And when I say Manning doesn't give people the context that at least I think is logical, the New York police said when they were challenged about why they did what they did, they said it was because somebody in Malcolm's entourage had asked them to withdraw the police. Now, interestingly enough, that's the same explanation the Memphis police give when Martin is whacked in Memphis. It's the same explanation that somebody in Martin's entourage had asked for the police detail to be taken away. In fact, the brother whose name escapes me at the moment, who was the chief of that detail, was called into a room with the FBI and the National Guard and the Secret Service claiming that his life was in danger. There was a threat on his life. Now here's just a nondescript black cop in Memphis, and supposedly somebody has has threatened his life. And remember who's in the room, the National Guard, the Secret Service, the FBI. And he says it doesn't matter, he's going to the Lorraine Motel anyway. Well, they don't let him do that. They escort him to his house. They keep him under virtual armed guard in his house so that he cannot protect Martin. And then Martin is whacked. And we're supposed to believe that James O'Reilly shot Martin from the bathtub of the rooming house. It is pointed out that that was impossible because there were brushes obscuring the sight, the vision from the bathtub to the Lorraine Motel. That was April the 4th. April the 5th at 6:30 a.m., the Memphis police come and cut the bushes down so that this story can be more consistent. You see the famous picture of Martin lying on outside his door in the Lorraine Motel. The four people gathered around him, one, just like Gene Roberts and Malcolm, one is a CIA, FBI, God knows what else agent who had infiltrated Martin's security that day in the absence of the regular detail. You should read a book called Act of State, Who Killed Martin Luther King Jr. At any rate, so in just the first few pages I've read, there's a context that Manning does not provide that I find highly dubious. I'm even prepared, I've seen the syllabus that he taught a seminar on Malcolm in 2007. And the first 3 pages of that syllabus in which he explains to students of Malcolm's life and meaning is absolutely perfect. It's perfect. He says not one thing that I would disagree with. So that seems to suggest that the book, that he knew better. So if he knew better, why did he write this opus that he has written? So I find it scurrilous, to be euphemistic.
Just so everybody is clear, there's a new major work that just came out, a very thick book on Malcolm X by Dr. Manning Marable called Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. And the late Dr. Marable passed away, was it 3 days before the publication of this major reworking of Malcolm X's life. And so just as a note so that everybody knows what we're talking about. And I would submit, as I stated in the introduction, this book, Malcolm X Make It Plain, Bill Strickland's book, is there would be no Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, in my opinion, had it not been for this book, which lays the foundation, spoke to the relatives, taught us things about Malcolm that we didn't know about over 10 years ago. And so that's not uncommon. Someone says we stand on the shoulders of giants sometimes. And so, so this new work is causing quite a bit of debate right now in the national media and press. So I think your talk today helped us illuminate and understand that work and that debate, I should say, and secondarily that work a little bit better as we rethink Malcolm, the theoretician we never knew. Is there any other questions today? Yes,
Whenever the system gets behind something, you should always be curious. You should always be suspicious.
Mr. Strickland,
That's a good point.
there's a picture of Malcolm and Martin that was taken. Can you share what period of time did they actually talk? You know, during that picture?
Yeah, it was just a chance encounter in Congress in Washington, D.C. after he had broken from the nation. Martin was testifying, Malcolm was in the gallery, and they met, and that's where that famous picture comes from. But you know, he had reached out to Martin subsequently. There were meetings, one of whom that Martin wasn't able to attend. I mean, I'm a Malcolmite, and so I'll die a Malcolmite. And when Martin was demonstrating, and Zeb did mention that I'm from Roxbury, which is where Malcolm spent a great deal of his life. And so did Farrakhan, the person you know as Farrakhan. His real name is Gene Walcott. He's also from Roxbury. Roxbury was the joint back in the day, Jack.
Calypso singer.
So, me and my boys are sitting around watching TV while Martin is demonstrating, and Martin is saying things like, "If any blood is to be spilled, let it be out." We said, "What's wrong with him?"
You're trying to party here.
What's wrong with this kid? So no, hey, that didn't happen. So I didn't appreciate Martin. I met Martin a couple of times, but I didn't really appreciate him because I wasn't into nonviolence. But ideological or anywhere else. But Vincent Harding worked with Martin. They were very close. When Vincent was counseling draft resistance, and they lived not very far from one another in Atlanta, and he was in Albany with Martin in '62. But after Martin was killed, Martin's widow, Coretta Scott King, they devised the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Center, and Vincent was the head of the center, and out of that center came that first and only independent black think tank, America, the Institute of the Black World. So Vincent got me thinking, appreciating Martin. And if you read his life, there's a fairly good book by another 600-page biography by a guy named David Garrow called Bearing the Cross. Martin is traveling all the time raising money for SCLC, for his organization. He's traveling without pause. And then you see him, as I mentioned, I didn't appreciate it at the time. Then you see him growing in his thought, in his thinking, in his analysis. So I have come to appreciate Martin now as a way that I did not appreciate him when I was your age. Somebody was over here had something. No.
I would just hasten to add to make a local connection as well, because we're both pretty familiar with the Boston Malcolm, but the Little family here in Omaha. Malcolm wasn't just born in Omaha. I mean, not just born in Omaha, but his parents were Garveyites, and organized here in Omaha a very early version of black nationalism, a story that needs to be told beyond just the fact that Malcolm himself was born here, that his parents and his family cultivated a critical response with his mother sending dispatches to the newspaper from the Omaha section. Where did I learn that? Learned that in this man's book, Malcolm X, Make It Plain. And I don't even think Manning talks about that as much. So I think at this time we have come to the conclusion. I want to thank Professor Bill Strickland for his talk today. This has been an amazing festival. At the 10-year mark, we are indebted to this gentleman for starting the Malcolm X Festival 10 years ago, Dr. Bob Chrisman. And while you're here, I know that you have to be here for class and that kind of thing, but take advantage of the fact that we have some of the architects of the field of black studies here with us this week, and they have made themselves accessible in their presentations and also outside to ask questions and to find out more about what black studies is about. So we thank you so much for being here today, and enjoy the rest of the festival.
They ain't got no dorms?
No. Well, they have a few, but you know, this was really a commuter school for a long time. Yeah, and it's transitioned over now to a more of a, it's starting to build dorms and things like that, but it just haven't been that way.
It was great, Dr.
Thank you, please.
Thank you.
Oh, God bless you, my child.
That's money.
I'll take that.
That'll
Yeah,
great.
it was great. I recorded all of it.
See, you like the,
I got you.
You and the FBI, this is always on my trail.
You know what?
Don't make me bring out your FBI.
Hater, and being so angry. The very first black historian was a man by the name of George Washington Williams, who began the first extended history of black people in this country shortly after the Civil War. And one of the things that he said, that George Washington Williams said, he said, I have tracked, I'm paraphrasing now, I have tracked my people through these pages, and these pages have been blistered with my tears. If you read black history, or Native American history, or Chinese history, if you read the history about the Mexican War, if you read about Vietnam, which you've never been told the truth about, there was a mutiny of the troops in Vietnam. You should read a book called Power of the Dragon. It gives you some, or see the DVD Hamburger Hill to see what Vietnam was really all about. But what Malcolm did was to think of Malcolm. It's not about Malcolm per se. It isn't about the minutiae of Malcolm's life. What Malcolm did was, and then you tell E.T. that of those 16 presidents, 11 were slave owners. What's your concept of America then? Or let us go to what makes America exceptional. What made America exceptional is that it had something called, quote, free land, unquote. Because the land in Europe was owned by the aristocracy, the monarchy, and the church. So the Pilgrims who came here, and that's another myth. The Pilgrims were a small minority on the Mayflower, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony is not the first permanent English settlement in this land. The first permanent English settlement in this land is Jamestown in 1607. But they don't want you to think about Jamestown as opposed to the Plymouth Plantation, because Jamestown is a creature of the Virginia Company. It was created by capitalists to make money, not people fleeing here to escape religious persecution. Nor do they tell you about the people who constituted the first so-called colonies. 50,000 of them were convicts. Australia only becomes a penal colony only charisma and by the seduction of his oratory. People don't know Malcolm was also a journalist. He first published Muhammad Speaks, and what we have are his speeches, but those speeches by one of his former assistants, Benjamin Goodman, only detailed from 1962 to 1965, and the collection's called The End of White World Supremacy. And then Malcolm X Speaks only goes from March 1964 until February 21st, 1965. So there is much of Malcolm still to be discovered. But as I say, the problem understanding Malcolm as a thinker is because listening to Malcolm was so emotionally fulfilling. He, he made real this concept that has been attributed to Jesse Jackson, I am somebody. He made you as an individual and black people generally feel that we were somebody. In a society, in a nation that found and suggested black people were unworthy, Malcolm affirmed this. And when people talk about Malcolm as being that, to take the history of black people, and he said that this history represents a repudiation of America's claims to be a nation committed to human equality and freedom. That our existence was the ultimate verification of that great untruth, that America was not what it claimed to be. Now go back to your high school days, or even your junior high school days. And suppose your history teacher asked you, let us estimate, conjecture, who were the greatest presidents America had. Usually people say Washington. More modern people will say Kennedy. Most people say Lincoln. And we say, all right, fine. And what president was Lincoln? He was the 16th president. Now I want you to imagine that E.T. comes down from his little world in the sky and asks you to explain America to him. And you begin with that fact, that Lincoln was the 16th of now 44 presidents. After the success of the American Revolution, the convicts that were in England were shipped here. And they sold women in Virginia, bride purchase for 2 barrels of tobacco. None of that's in your history. So here we have this so-called free land, except there were some people inhabiting it called Native Americans. So go back to your presidential example. And let us ask, in these years, in the treaties that were made between the American government and the Native American peoples, how many of those treaties did they break? They broke all 400 treaties. So then where is this great morality? And you see, that's what Malcolm represented. Malcolm said, the most rewarding study of all is the study of history. To know the history. And if you plunge into that history, if any of you are in English, you need to read a book. It's a collection of short stories by Richard Wright. Most people believe Native Son is Richard Wright's greatest contribution to American literature. I disagree. You need to read a collection called Uncle Tom's